Welcome to the Modern Day Heroes podcast. I am elated about today's guest. We have with us our dear friend Dolf, and I'm so excited to dive deep into your story, your experiences. Just, man, you have quite the resume.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. It really is.
Thank you for being here. This is a blast. I want to dive deep into a lot of real estate today, but in order to get us kicked off, give us the origin of Dolf. Tell us who you are and maybe a little bit of background of how we're sitting here today and who you came to be.
Okay, so my name is Dolf. I was born in New Zealand. I came from parents that originated in Europe, from the Netherlands, and they never had the opportunity to go to university, so they drummed into my sister and I that if you want to do well in life, you have to study hard and get a degree. So with that, off I went to university. But during my first week there, I looked around at me at the people with the degrees, the professors, the tutors, and the lecturers, and it occurred to me that they were not uniformly wealthy.
So is this in New Zealand?
Yes.
Okay.
So I thought there's something wrong with this formula that degrees equates to wealth, you know. So I decided to make a study of the rich. I wanted to know, what do the rich have in common? Thinking perhaps naively, if I could identify 30 or 40 things that they had in common, and if I could emulate most of those, I'd have a good shot at being rich. Challenge was I could hardly find anything they had in common. It wasn't age, it wasn't gender, it wasn't religion, it wasn't whether you were an immigrant or not, or firstborn, lastborn, anywhere in between. I could only find two things they had in common. And one of them was that almost without exception, the rich either made their money or held their wealth in real estate. And I thought, well, if that's all it is, I can do that. So I set out to find my first property. I was really young. I was a teenager. And when I was like 17, I looked 12, which was it was a problem trying to date a 17-year-old girl, because even if she knew you were 17, she didn't want to be seen by her girlfriends with someone who looked 12, right?
It pays off when you're 30, though.
It paid off big time later on, I agree. But anyway, so when I went to apply for a mortgage, I gave my spiel to the bank manager. And he sat there waiting patiently. And when I finished talking, he leaned forward and he said, "Are you done?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "This is a hoax, isn't it?" He thought it was a university prank. And I was devastated because I really wanted to buy the property, right? Anyway, fortunately, I didn't say, well, I'm clearly not cut out for this. I better try my hand at something else. I went to bank after bank after bank, probably improving my pitch each time.
And what was the mortgage process, 40 years ago?
It was a bit different. We had 4 trading banks, and I had no money at all. So I went to each bank and asked for a maximum student loan. And fortunately, none of them asked me if I was also going to any other banks, because honesty would have compelled me to say yes.
Sure.
So I got $4,000 together with all these student loans, and that was my down payment.
Cool.
And then I had to apply for a conventional mortgage for the remainder. And it was a little wooden villa split into 2 units, and it had 2 more motel-style units out the back. So I had 4 tenants. And when I collected the rent for that first month, it was more money than that month's allocation of mortgage payment and insurance and a sinking fund for some repairs. And I'd made a profit and I hadn't worked for it. So I thought, man, I've got to do this again.
What was the purchase price, if you don't mind me asking?
$97,000.
$97,000.
Yeah, it seems like a song today.
That's amazing for 4 units.
Yeah, well, but that was also, many decades ago.
Sure.
But I wasn't sure whether this formula would work, so I carried on doing my studies, and I ended up with an honors bachelor's degree in electrical engineering. And the university came to me and they said, it's only 1 more year for a master's, why don't you do that? And I said, because, and I didn't have an answer. So I did it. And halfway through that, they said, you're doing so well, why don't you switch to PhD? And I said, because, and again, I didn't have an answer, so I did that. And the moral of this part of the story is make sure you know why you do what you're doing. Otherwise, you end up leading other people's lives. So I spent 8 years at university, got a PhD in electrical engineering. Parents very proud, of course. Degrees equates to wealth, right? And I admit I went to 2 job interviews. And at the end of the second interview, they offered me a job at $32,000 a year, which back then was a lot of money.
I bet.
But unfortunately for them, the week before I completed a real estate deal, that netted me $35,000. And I remember thinking, why would anyone in his or her right mind work for 40 hours a week, right, 50 weeks a year for $32,000, when in 1 week you can make 35 and take the rest of the year off? So I never took that job. To this day, I've never had one. I was 35 years old, visiting my parents in Europe. They'd moved back to Europe. They picked me up from the airport, and as we were driving home, my mother said, "You know, it's not too late." And I looked at my watch thinking, for a dinner with an aunt or something, perhaps. I said, "For what?" She said, "For you to get a job." And I said, "Why would I want a job?" She said, "You don't have a pension plan, like a 401 or an IRA or whatever."
Watching out for your security.
Yeah. Anyway, that's sort of the background as to how I got into real estate.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Now, let me ask you this. Master's, PhD, bachelor's, you've done it all from the schooling system. Never used it, hypothetically, within your job. Do you regret spending that time in that investment of getting your master's, getting your PhD?
It's so interesting because so many people ask that very question, and they'll even be more blunt and say, what a monumental waste of time. And yet I have a different philosophy on it. I don't think we go to school to learn facts and figures, certainly not in engineering, because everything I learned the operating characteristics of valves, and not faucet-type valves, but valve radio-type valves, and transistors and integrated circuits, you name it. And all of that has been made redundant, right, by new technology. However, I don't think I learned those facts and figures. I learned creative ways of solving problems. Here's a problem, engineer a solution for it. I had 8 years of training how to find a way that other people hadn't thought of. That's how you develop something new. And so what I do in my day-to-day life now is I find new ways of raising money for a deal, or new ways of deploying a piece of real estate that's been sitting vacant for 3 years and no one else could figure out how to get a tenant. Well, there was a thrift shop there and everyone thought it's a thrift shop location. Yet the foot traffic is so high, it's the perfect location for a coffee shop. But even the people who end up becoming my tenants operating the coffee shop, they don't think of asking to rent that space because they see it as a... So I think doing engineering is a great training for business in general.
Well, and it sounds like people refer to you as the king of creativity. And it sounds like those have been the foundational principles for that creativity.
I believe so. I'd go a step further and say when you study things at university, there are two classes of things you can study. There are analysis subjects where you analyze what's there. You study language, English, for instance. Here's the subject, here's the verb, here's the object. You pull it to pieces, label it, put it back together. You study history, it's analysis. You study accounting, it's analysis of what's happened in the past. Chemistry, physics, you name it. There are very few things that are not analysis, but rather synthesis. Sculpture, creative writing, architecture, you create something new. And engineering is in that category. And that's why I think if you can study something which is synthesis rather than analysis, it puts you in good stead for anything you want to do in life.
So moving forward with your real estate journey, you get your PhD, you get your master's, and I assume you start diving full-time all into real estate.
Correct.
Does that look like flipping? Does that look like development? What does that look like, and what are the stages and phases you went in?
Okay, so they're all really interesting topics because I know many people who are flippers, and full disclosure, some of them do way better than I'll ever do in my entire lifetime, but I don't like flipping for a number of fundamental reasons. Firstly, you make good profit when you flip, but it's not considered a capital gain. It's considered your working income. It's what you do for a living. So you pay full income tax on it. Secondly, if you sell something, you'll never make another dollar from it. So a property that someone flipped 18 years ago and 6 years ago and 3, they're never going to earn another cent. Whereas something I bought 18 years ago and 6 months ago and whatever, I'm still generating revenue from it. And that revenue is indexed for inflation. And the asset generating that revenue is going up too. So I have a theory that whenever someone sells a property, they usually end up living long enough to regret it. And I'll hear it so often from people who say, oh, if only I'd kept it. And the further you go back in time, the bigger the regret. You know, a long time ago, my parents bought a house for $5,000, 1968. 10 years later, they sold it for $32,000. And they thought they'd struck the jackpot because that profit, Blake, that was more than my dad earned by having a salaried income for that entire decade. And not only was it more money, but it gave us a place to live so we didn't have to pay rent. $32,000. If you go on Zillow today, it's $875,000. They could have made another $750,000 and had collected rental income for 40 years just by not selling it. So flipping is not on my scheme of what I would recommend people. If you want long-term wealth, you don't flip. You might flip a few on the side to give you the cash to invest long-term. but that's flipping. Developing, you mentioned that as well. The pattern I've seen over and over again is that people do a small development. They build one house or a threeplex or something. It's, oh my gosh, I've made so much money. This is more than my salary job for the last year. I'm going to do it again. But instead of doing 3, I'm going to do 10. And they do 10, and now they make $2 million. And they think they've mastered it.
Sure.
They think so we're going to do one more, honey, and this time we're going to do a 38-unit development, and it's going to take all the money we've got, and we're going to borrow more, but we're going to make 20 million, and we'll be free. And then what happens next is not as if one thing goes horribly wrong. A whole series of things go slightly wrong. Interest rates are up a bit, pre-sales are down a bit, demand for that kind of house has gone down a bit. Bottom line is that they go broke. And someone else picks up the defunct development for a song. And I see this pattern all the time. And I got seduced into doing a development once, and we did a massive development. And those exact same things that I'd kind of predicted, I should have listened to my own advice. They conspired, and everything turned against us in the economy. It was around 2008, and we lost the whole thing. So I invest for the long term. When I buy a property, the day I close, I want there to be positive cash flow. Now, that means, Blake, that most people, when they hear that and think, well, I'm going to do that too, they look for a property that's fully leased, right? But the challenge with a property that's fully leased is that yields are very low. Here we often kind of mistakenly talk about the cap rate is low, but the returns are very low, 3 or 4% depending on the area, and even 6. Even if you can get a 6% return on a fully leased building with mortgage rates currently at 7 or 8%, you can't make them cash flow. So I have made an art out of looking for vacant or semi-vacant buildings. Now, I don't buy them, because if I buy them, I still have to pay property tax, and if I've got no income, I've got a problem. But before buying it, I'll look for a tenant. And I used to do it kind of surreptitiously, because my fear was that if my potential tenant found out the building was for sale, he might want to buy it from under my nose. But in decades now of doing this, that's never happened. They don't want to buy it, or they want to but don't have the money, they want to rent. So I'll give you an example. I came across a vacant funeral parlor. What do you do with a vacant funeral parlor, right? It's been vacant for 3 years. You know, sometimes when I say this in front of a live audience, a restaurant, you know, it's kind of, well, it would have to be vegetarian almost. The thought of, you know, just no one knew what to do. That's why it was vacant, and the price kept on coming down. So I employed someone at the then going hourly rate of $8 an hour to phone every funeral director going further and further from this location, until she found someone that said, oh yes, I'd love to rent that. So then she put him on the phone with me. And I said, listen, the building's for sale. No, I don't want to buy it. I need someone to buy it for me. I said, well, listen, go and check it out. If you like it, and if you are willing to sign an agreement where, subject to me buying it, you will become the tenant, then I'm willing to have a crack at buying it. Well, he looked at it and said, no, it's fabulous. Let's go ahead. I said, well, let's come up with an agreement. He said, well, not so fast. I'll only do it if you give me a long-term lease. Well, that's what we want as an investor, right? So, you know, another rule I've got, one is seldom sell. Another one is never be the first to name a figure, because that person usually loses. I would have been happy with a 5-year lease. That seems like a long time. Sure. Right? But instead of suggesting that, I said, how long would you want? And he said, I'd really like 10 years with a right of renewal for another 10 years. I said, done. So we signed up this agreement. I put in an offer. I bought it for a song. I bought it on the basis of it being empty, and it wasn't worth much, but I already had a tenant lined up at then $30,000 a year. So it was valued so much that when the bank looked at it, they funded all but $10,000 of the purchase price. I only had $10,000 in there.
Wow.
So, you know, I now look almost exclusively for vacant or semi-vacant buildings. Then I try and find a tenant, and if I do, the building's worth more to me than it is to the seller, and everyone can still win.
Wow. Mainly on the commercial side or residential as well?
So I do both. I focus on the commercial side because I think there are some fundamental advantages that once you're into property, that becomes very appealing. Having said that, I started with residential. I think it's smart for most people to learn the ropes with residential. We all understand residential. Anyone can walk through a house and say, well, it'll be hard to get a tenant for this house because there's no front door, or there's no roof, or there's no bathroom. We'd notice that. But with commercial, most people don't know what to look for. They don't know how to decide if this is a good deal or not. But with a bit of experience, that's easy to
and
do.
So if you distinguish between residential and commercial, what would you say are the top 3 benefits that commercial has over residential? For example, you just named usually leases are a lot longer. Usually the tenants have to pay for repairs. Dive into the top 3 things that are like, yes, this is why I love commercial more than residential.
Okay, well, firstly, there's a philosophical difference. When you deal with residential properties, you're essentially dealing with people. I know there are some contracts involved, like the residential tenancy agreement, but you're dealing with people. So the tenant will call you and say, hey, the toilet's blocked. Could you please send someone to unblock it? And you say, well, hang on a minute. That's the 3rd time this month. What on earth are you putting in there?
Right,
And they say,
right.
none of your stinking business. Get someone to fix it. So you call the plumber. Can you come tomorrow? Yes, how about 10 a.m.? You call the tenant and says, nope, I'm busy at 10. How about 4 p.m.? You're dealing with people.
Right.
Contrast that with commercial, where I know there are people involved, the lessee or the tenant and the agent and all that. But essentially, you're dealing with contracts. Everything is spelled out in a very detailed commercial lease. So it's just easier to deal with black and white contracts that can be arbitrated than with the opinion of someone who is always trying to hoodwink you. Then we get to the situation that commercial tenants tend to earn their income on the premises. That means they have a vested interest in keeping it looking good. I have a tenant that calls me every year and says, Dolf, according to the lease, I have to call you before making any changes like painting. Do I have your permission to paint the building again this year? And I say, yes, of course.
Wow.
Because he wants it sparkling for his clients. I've never had a residential tenant call me to say, hey, can I paint the outside? Or can I put flower boxes in the window? Nothing like that. They'll occasionally call me to say, there's a hole in the wall. And I'll say, how did that happen? And they'll admit, though, I got angry and I punched my fist through it. But it's your wall. You better fix it.
Right.
And that never happens with commercial. Thirdly, you mentioned the long-term leases. There's also this notion that if a tenant has a 1-year lease on a residential house, residential tenant, and after 6 months they get a new job, and they say, hey, I want to get out of my lease, you can technically say no, but they say, this is my buddy Fred wants to move in, can he take over? And you agree to that. And Fred moves in, and then after 1 month, Fred doesn't pay the rent. You can go after Fred maybe, but you can't go after the original tenant. With commercial real estate, there is a document called an assignment of lease, which is an agreement between the landlord, the outgoing tenant, and the incoming tenant. And it means that if the incoming tenant doesn't pay, then the outgoing tenant still has to pay it. It's an incentive for the seller to make sure that the guy who's buying the business can actually run it. Otherwise, if he wants out of the lease, right, he'd sell the business for $1 to a bum off the street and then not worry about it. You can't pursue him. So there's that advantage. There are just so many advantages that makes us. And the biggest advantage of all over the world, it's the same. When a residential tenant doesn't pay the rent, in many parts of the world, take California, you can't even contact them for 3 months because the notion is that the poor, pure, clean living, unsuspecting, innocent, kind, sweet tenant, it's not his fault that he can't pay the rent. It's society's fault, of which the landlord is part of the problem. So that rapacious, racketeering pig of a landlord shouldn't be able to write a letter demanding the rent. All right. Whereas with commercial real estate, they don't have rules like that. It's spelled out. Whatever's in the lease is there. And you can say the rent shall be paid on the first of the month, failing which there shall be a 2% penalty, and then interest shall be charged at the rate of whatever you agree in there, 1 or 2% a month, 0.5% a month. And the law stands behind you. You try doing that in California. In Amsterdam, it's even worse. If you're a squatter for more than 6 months, you get ownership rights. What an incentive to be a squatter.
Twisted world.
Yeah, not on commercial, though. So anyway, there are all these advantages.
So in the industry I'm in, I do door-to-door sales. And a lot of what we preach is to buy assets. And typically it's just get into a single family, get a duplex, something residential, house hack it. It's just a simple way with a low amount of money to get into real estate. Mm-hmm. And after listening to you, I think you've convinced me to to go into commercial now. And so I hope those that are listening can pay attention to that, because society, Instagram, social media is always talking about residential. And I very rarely hear the benefits of commercial and the things that you have mentioned, longer leases, people having to do the upkeep, people having a vested interest. That makes your job as a landlord 10x the job as a residential landlord. I assume very little phone calls. I assume not a lot of maintenance. because they're doing most of that, correct?
You're absolutely correct. The tenant does most of it. I have to keep the commercial building watertight, but other than that, the tenant does just about everything.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And you're right, I get few phone calls. The most frequent phone call I get from a commercial tenant is, hey, Dolf, is there any chance I can get a 5-year extension on the lease? And I'll look it up and I'll say, but you've still got 3 years to run. And they'll say, anyway, getting back to the question, is there any way I can get a 5? Now, why would he want a 5-year extension on a lease that's still got 3 years remaining, right? It's a good question.
It's beautiful.
And the answer is that inherent in the value of his business is this notion of goodwill. Like if he wants to sell his business, it's the turnover that he's generating that's going to help determine the price, but also the location and whether there's going to be a big freeway built in front of it. If there is, that's going to decrease the value, right? But he also wants to know that the incoming tenant, the buyer of the business, that they've got longevity of lease. So the business is worth more with an 8-year lease than with a 3-year lease. And so they'll often ask for an extension just so that they can sell it for a higher price. That's pretty cool. Can't get that with residential.
Yeah, you can't. That's incredible. So shifting a little bit, your resume, like I said at the beginning, is very impressive. One of the things that I noticed that stuck out to me is there was a time period that you sold 52 homes in 52 weeks. Tell us about this. Or, sorry, you didn't sell. You bought.
I bought them, yeah.
This is amazing. You bought 52 homes in 52 weeks. And I actually think it was less than 52 weeks at the end of the day, right?
It ended up being less.
Dive deep into this. I'm so intrigued.
So I was in my office in Phoenix, that's where I'm based. I've been there for 22 years or something. And I had an appointment in the afternoon canceled. So I thought, well, I'll jump on a flight to Vegas. It's only 37 minutes flying time from Phoenix to Vegas. So I went there and I arrived back at my office just at closing time and all the staff were leaving and they said, where did you go? I said, I went to Vegas. They said, what, to gamble? I said, no, the real jackpots are in the suburbs. I said, but I did buy a house and it required none of my own cash and it's cash flow positive. And my staff looked at me and said, you can't do that. And that was an eye-opener for me because we're essentially a real estate investment company and a real estate education company, right? We help other people get into this space. And if my staff think it's impossible to buy a house without using any of your own cash and it being cash flow, no wonder the rest of the world probably thinks it's impossible. So I made a public announcement the next day that I would buy one house a week for an entire year in Vegas without using any of my own money.
All in Vegas.
All in Vegas.
Wow.
I was 3 months into it. I'd only bought 2 houses. And I thought, oh, gosh, what a fool I was to announce it publicly. Because I'm not just going to have egg on my face. I'm going to have the entire omelet type thing, right? But then I learned more and more of these techniques. And towards the end of this quest, I was buying 3 houses in an afternoon, sometimes sight unseen. And I finished the 52, as you alluded to, in 9 months.
Wow.
And now that I think about it, that's a human gestation period. So you can buy 52 homes in the time it takes to make a baby, so that's not a bad deal. But the real question is, well, how is that even possible and can it happen again? And I think we're headed into some turbulent times with real estate. And maybe many listeners will think commercial real estate, but I read in the newspaper, read another article this morning where they think commercial real estate's going to crash.
Right.
And my answer is, well, is that good or bad? And by the way, Blake, the answer to any question I pose is always, it depends, right? The answer to the question, is it good or bad that commercial real estate is going to crash? It depends on whether you're the owner of the commercial real estate that's crashing or whether you're the potential buyer. Because again, if we can find a use for a commercial building that's crashed, and by that I presume they mean the value's plummeted, that no one else has thought of, or maybe they thought of it, but they didn't implement it, and it could be worth a lot more to us. So what was happening in Vegas? Prices were rising very quickly, a bit like after the 2008 crash, and it goes through cycles. And unfortunately, time ensures that we get old. But one of the benefits of getting old.
What year was this that you underwent that process?
2003, 2004.
Okay.
So there was another big rise in prices then. So they were going up rapidly. But many people were still losing their jobs. There was a crisis in the economy. So they'd bought a house, say, for $150,000. They got a mortgage for $120,000. But now they lost their job and they split up with their spouse or their boyfriend or girlfriend. And so they'd go into pre-foreclosure. Pre-foreclosure is a requirement by law in America that before a bank can foreclose on someone, they have to issue an NOD, a notice of default, and put it in a public document. So I'd get the Las Vegas legal daily news, births, deaths, marriages, company dissolutions, company formations,
Wow.
and NODs. And there would be a list of 30, 40 properties where in 90 days' time, those people would be taken into foreclosure.
Yep.
So I would knock on their door and I would say, hey, I understand the property's got some problems. Never say you're in trouble, because then they get very defensive. And they weren't really in trouble, their property. I understand your property is in trouble. Half the time they say, no, it's not, and boom, they'd slam the door in your face, and then 90 days later you'd see it go into foreclosure. But, more often than not, probably, they'd say, yeah, I know, my girlfriend left me and I lost my job and I just want to go back to Minnesota or Boston or wherever they came from. And I'd say, well, I don't know if I could help you, but if I could, what would that look like? And they'd say, well, I owe the bank $5,000. I just want to get out of here. If you pay me the $5,000 to get the bank off my back, I'll quit claim deed you the property.
Subject to.
Yes, quit claim deed, again, is another uniquely American thing. You can't do this in France or Germany or Japan, where you can sign over your interest in a property without it having to go through a formal escrow process. It's a one-page document and you own it. The interesting thing, though, is that the seller who, issues the quitclaim deed to you, he still owns the mortgage. So I'd say, all right, I'm happy to pay you the $5,000, but I have a question. Would you mind staying on the mortgage for a bit? And they'd say, stay on the mortgage? I can't afford the mortgage now. That's why I'm in trouble. Why would I stay on the mortgage? I said, well, hang on. I said, I'll pay the mortgage every month. Well, how do I know you'll pay the mortgage? I said, well, I'm paying you $5,000 now. If I don't pay the mortgage, the bank will still foreclose. You'll lose the house, but I'll lose my $5,000 and anything I've paid in the meantime. So, well, why would you do that? And I said, listen, here's the deal. If I have to take on a new mortgage, firstly, we have to go through escrow. I have to apply for a mortgage. That's going to be a $500 application fee. I don't mind that so much. I have to fill out all these forms. Then we wait 3 weeks. And because for me it will be an investment property, unlike you, where it was an own occupant, I'm going to only get 80%. I have to come up with 20%.
Right.
But if you're willing to stay on the mortgage, I'll pay the mortgage every month and we can do the deal today. And he'll say, well, what's in it for me? I said, I'll tell you what, if I buy this house and go through the formal process, then you've got a big black X by your name because you were in foreclosure. But if you let me pay the mortgage every month for the next 2 years, your credit rating will go way going up. And they'd say, wow, and you'll do that for me? You say, sure. So we'd do the deal. Now, smart listeners are going to say, hang on a minute, Dolf, there's a flaw in that argument because you said it didn't require any cash and you just admitted you're paying $5,000. Well, how I'd overcome that is I would then, instead of renting the house out as a conventional rental, I'd do a lease to buy or a lease option or rent to buy. It goes by various names. But a lease option effectively means that the tenant pays an option fee for the right to buy the property in the future, sometimes at a fixed price, sometimes at a fixed date. So they might become a tenant for $1,700 a month.
Interesting.
I have to pay the bank $1,500 a month to pay the mortgage, so I've got a small margin there. But they have the right where, say, in 2 years' time, they can buy the property for $250,000. And the advantage of having a lease option tenant is twofold. Firstly, you get the fee up front, and you can keep that forever. And secondly, because they think they're going to own it, they look after it better. So guess what my option fee was? In this case, it would have been $5,000 because that's what I needed to pay. And then the only other sort of thing I had to deal with is that most mortgages have a due on sale clause.
Yep.
That means that if the property ever gets sold or ownership transferred, then the mortgage technically is due. So I'd go to the bank in question and say, hello, Mr. Bank Manager, I understand you have a mortgage with John and Mary Smith. And he'd look at them and say, oh, yes, they owe us $5,000. And I'd say, well, listen, they're kind of new friends of mine, and I'm thinking of paying the $5,000 off for them. And he'll say, really? You'd do that? He said, well, would you like a cup of tea or coffee by chance? And I'd say, no, I was just as thirsty as I was before I told you that. No, I didn't say that, but I felt like saying that. And he'd say, wow, no. I said, but I just want one assurance. If I do that, I want to make sure that you don't invoke the due on sale code. No, of course not.
Interesting.
And then 2 weeks later, I'd be at the same bank manager's office, and he'd say, you again? I'd say, yeah, I've got some more friends, Tom and Samantha Smith. And he'd say, oh, yeah, they owe us $6,000. You're willing to pay theirs off as well? Uh-huh. And you don't want me to invoke the due on? Uh-huh. He said, okay. You know what would happen the next week, Blake? He would call me. He knew what I was doing. He'd say, hey, I think I've
No
got some new
way.
friends for you.
No way.
They became my source of
No
property
way.
deals. Pre-approved because the tenant wanted to get out. They were still, pretty good. They weren't that far behind. They were willing to leave. They were willing to do the quitclaim deed.
You got the bank finding deals for
The
you.
bank was finding
That is
deals for me.
incredible.
And they saw me as a savior. Because for a bank,
sure.
to take a house
Massive
through
win-win.
foreclosure is a
Absolutely.
big cost and expense, yeah.
That is so genius.
Yeah.
Now, would you do an agreement with them, or was it just verbal? Just, hey, don't exercise the due on sale clause.
That's kind of, the truth is I didn't have a formal agreement. I did it on word of honor. I don't know. This is 20 years ago now. I
Sure.
don't know if you can still do that. The world has gotten a bit rougher.
Sure.
But I come from a culture where when you shake a hand and look someone in the eye, you have to honor that, because worse than any legal process they could take you is just the feeling of betraying someone. But I know that not everyone feels that way, so I'm torn between those two worlds.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. What an amazing process. And that's going back to being the king of creativity. That's the most effective way to buy real estate. And when this friend of yours that you paid $5,000, did you also get all the equity that he had built up to that point?
Well, that was the deal. That was the advantage for me.
I'll save you from foreclosure, from bankruptcy.
I'll make your credit rating go way back up.
I'll take over your property at your current interest rate, and I get all the equity.
Yeah.
Amazing.
They were happy to get out of it.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's incredible. So the first book I ever read, I was 20 years old, about entrepreneurship, was a book called Rich Dad, Poor Dad.
Oh, yes.
And Robert Kiyosaki happens to be a friend of yours. Tell us how you guys met and what that relationship's like and what you've learned from Robert over the years.
Oh, gosh. I've learned a lot. That was, a fun ride to be involved in. I don't know how long you want that story. There's a whole history of how we got to meet. And
please do. Dive in.
so I did an event in a little village called Timaru, about 15,000 people, and I was walking down the main street the next day past a secondhand bookshop, and I saw a book called If You Want to Be Rich and Happy, Then Don't Go to School. And I thought, I missed out on a lot of school. I want to read that book. And it was by Robert Kiyosaki. It was his first book.
He's very passionate about that topic.
Yeah. And then I flew to another tiny place called Waikanae of 2,000 people. I was running an event there. And the real estate agent who picked me up from the airport, who was my host, if you like, for the event, I gave him the book. And this is down in New Zealand, right? Waikanae, 2,000 people, little village. And I said, read this book. It's really good. He said, oh, that's from my neighbor, Bob Kiyosaki. I said, firstly, it's not Bob, it's Robert. And you live in Waikanae. This is some Japanese-American guy living in Oregon at the time. I said, you're dreaming. He said, no, I used to live in Hawaii, and he did too, and we were neighbors, and we played rugby together. I said, well, tell me about it. So I had this desire to meet him. So I attended an event as an attendee in Wellington called Money and You. And at the end of it, it was a 3-day event. The guy who ran it, and there were about 160 people there, he said, I want to have breakfast with you. And I thought, well, that's odd. But anyway, he said, I've been watching you over breakfast. And he said, you should go to this event in Hawaii. It's called the Business School for Entrepreneurs. And I said, okay, I'll do it sometime. He said, no, it's next week. I said, well, I can't. I've got a closing of a property. I've got my own event running. I had something else on. He said, no, you should go. This reason, that reason. I said, no, too busy. How much is it? And it was $5,000, which in the 1990s was a lot of money, plus airfares from New Zealand, accommodation for 10 days. And I said, well, who's teaching it? And he mentioned Robert Kiyosaki, the author of this book that I'd read. I said, oh. So I ended up going. And Robert had this rule that he said, I'm the government, and I'm here to teach you that you don't mess with the government. And you're going to learn that by not being late. There's no such thing as being on time. You're either early or you're late. And if you don't want to be late, then you have to be early. I don't care if it's 1 minute or 3 minutes early, but just don't be late. In fact, if you are late, we're going to fine you $500 cash.
Wow.
And you get 3 minutes to pay. And if you don't pay in 3 minutes, it's up to $1,000. Another 3 minutes, if you don't pay, you're kicked out. No refunds, no money back, no excuses, no tears, out. And it didn't bother me because I thought, if I'm paying all that money to be there, why would I want to be late, right?
Sure.
So anyway, on the very first day, this girl came running up to me. Marilu was her name. And she said, Dolf, I've been fined $500. Do you have any cash on you? Well, I have a theory about why one should always have cash on them. So I said, sure. And I gave her $500. And she ran off and paid the fee. And that afternoon she came in and said, thank you so much. Here's your money back, right? End of story, you'd think. The next day she comes running up to me with someone on her running team. We had business teams and running teams, and said, here's Mike. He's also been fined. Do you still have the money? And I said, yes, sure. So I gave it to him, right? And he ran off and paid the fine. But I didn't see him for the next 3 days. And then I had to hunt him down. There were about 350 people at this event. We were assigned all these tasks and things. But eventually I found him and said, hey, Mike, remember me? He said, yeah, you're the guy who gave me the money. I said, well, I didn't give it to you. I lent it to you. I said, when are you going to pay it back? He said, oh, I'm not. I said, why not? He said, well, I don't have it. I said, well, where are you from? And he was from Perth in Australia. I said, you better get someone there to wire you the money. Well, I don't have anyone there to wire me the money. And that night, Mike wrote a letter to the government, right, to Robert, basically complaining, saying, this is nonsense. Why should we be fined? It doesn't affect anyone, all that. So the next morning, start of class, 8 o'clock,
Wow.
Robert says, Mike so-and-so, stand up, tears him to shreds.
I bet.
Absolutely excoriates him, right? And says, sit down. Well, that night, Mike writes an even sterner letter, complaining about being told off and all this sort of thing. So the next morning, Mike, stand up. Everyone groans. Now he really takes him to task.
Wow.
And when he's finished, he said, sit down. Now, where's the sucker who gave him the money? And I said, oh, God.
He dragged you into this.
Yeah, so I stand up and he bellowed, do you always give money to complete strangers? I said, no, not always, And he said, what do you have to say for yourself? Now, you've got to remember my state. I went there because I wanted to meet the author of that book. And here I was, one of 350-odd people. And now I was going to be torn to shreds by him. So I was kind of devastated. Anyway, I don't know what you would have said, but I said, listen, firstly, we should keep it all in perspective. It's only $500. Maybe he needs it more than I do. But secondly, and more importantly, we should not seek to become a depository into which money is put, because eventually it will fill up and the flow will stop. But rather, we should seek to become a conduit through which money can flow, and let's make that conduit as large as possible. And he was glaring at me for what at the time seemed like 2 minutes, but it was probably more like 10 seconds. I could see the veins in his face pulsating, and I was petrified as to what he was going to do next. But he said, sit down. And I felt defeated. I mean,
I'm sure.
I'm
I'm sure.
Thought, no, this has destroyed any chance of meeting him or whatever. And at the end of the 10-day event, I was checking out. It was at the Kona Surf Resort, which at the reception area has a thatch roof, but no walls really. It's all open and airy. And I was minding my own business at the checkout counter, and Kiyosaki was, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 yards away. And he said, De Roos, come over here. And I said, no, you come here. And he did. And he said, we should teach together.
Wow.
And that's literally how it started.
Wow.
A week later, we ran an event together in Brisbane.
No way.
And then I had a 5-year run, a great run with him and the whole Rich Dad gang. There were 5 Rich Dad's advisors. I was a Rich Dad advisor in real estate. I came out with the book in the Rich Dad advisor series called Real Estate Riches. We had a great time. So yeah, I learned a lot from him and from the whole gang, really.
Look at that. And what's he up to now? I feel like he has kind of stepped away from a lot of that.
Yeah, he's still doing things. He's still very popular, and and many people still remember. Like you just mentioned, that was your first book. I hear that from so many people.
He's a great writer.
Yeah,
he's a great writer. That's fun. What a unique story that throws us.
So I'm sorry it was a long story, but when you say how did you meet? There was a whole background to that.
No, it's so intriguing.
Yeah.
So to kind of begin finishing things off here. Your life has been filled with real estate, and it's been filled with knowledge and teaching and inspiring and impacting others, which has been amazing. And you've created wealth and probably have taught a lot of other people to create massive wealth as well through real estate. Recognizing that, what's been your greatest accomplishment up to this point?
Gosh, I think it would have to be being a dad. I think, we all try to do well as a dad, and I saw your little kid here a little while ago, and, he's obviously happy in your company. And being a parent doesn't come with a manual, as everyone knows, so you're always second-guessing yourself. Am I doing too much of this and not enough of that? But, you start to see some results, and I think, that's my best accomplishment. I've done well there. But I'm kind of happy at the feedback I get that a lot of people claim that I, at the very least, contributed significantly to them becoming financially free. I love helping people become free That's sort of my mission now. How can I help? Because we go through school. My daughter did it. I went through 18 years of education. Not 1 hour was devoted to any financial literacy. How to balance a checkbook. Well, that's all archaic now. But how to balance a digital or whatever. Nothing. It's just assumed we'll learn that through osmosis or some other way. And most people, and America, which is the richest country on this planet in terms of GDP per capita, I'm astounded at how many people are living at anywhere near what I'd call the poverty line. And they say that 60% of Americans, when they retire, they can't put their hands on 20,000 cash.
Wow.
It's almost shameful. And why don't we devote more energy and time into teaching people the merits of investing and the relative merits of different investment vehicles and the risks involved with these things? So that's my passion, really, to help get the message out that if you put not all of your energy into it, but some of it, you can do so much better.
And what would be your definition of freedom?
Freedom is, if we went down the road to get a cup of coffee or something, I don't think we'd say before putting our orders in, well, how much does it cost? I want to see if I've got enough. I think if people can buy an airline ticket to go and see family or go on without having to ask what the price is, that's a form of freedom. If you've got a pathway to having your house paid off within a reasonable time frame, so that, you're earning more than you're spending, that's freedom. Most people are, the question is, how long can you live without having your job before you run out of cash? And for most people, it's 3 or 4 months. For some, it's even worse. They live literally paycheck to paycheck. So freedom is where you've got passive income that is a little bit greater, at the very least, than your expenses. The challenge is, as we earn money, we all find things to spend it on. I need a bigger car. I need a second car. I need a third holiday. I need... and just live within your means. Figure out ways of expanding your revenue. And the best way to do that is through passive income.
If I could clap, I would. Thank you so much. I love that. Well, Dolf, it's been an honor. I've learned so much from you, and I hope the viewers as well will experience the same thing I did. If we want to continue to learn from you and be inspired by you, what's the best way to do so?
Well, I am doing a live broadcast, a live event coming up on March the 14th, where I'm going to show people how I find residential deals, commercial deals, and even business deals, how to find them, how to vet them or analyze them, and figure out which is good or not. It's not just a matter of finding good deals, but it's also a matter of avoiding the lemons, because one lemon avoided can save you 5 years of being set back financially, and then how to actually take it down. And a simple way of going there is just to go to dolflive.com/hero. We made it an easy...
I'll make sure to put the link below.
Okay, cool. And then, I've got a rather unique name that's got some disadvantages, but it's got a host of advantages. So if they just search my name, Dolf de Roos, they'll find it on most social media and the websites and all that. I've got dolfderoos.com. But no, dolflive.com/hero, and then you can listen. It's free to attend, and we give you all kinds of clues as to how you can get started on this pathway to financial freedom.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. We'll add that link below, and we look forward to continue learning from you. Thank you for your time.
You're so welcome. Thank you, too. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, my friend. Appreciate it.